Cool. Yeah, also for me, thanks for coming. I hope this will be useful, not just for all the people here, but also for the, field of well-being at large, so that we can make some progress. So what I thought to do with this presentation was just to give a very high-level overview of sort of the standard assumptions people make in standard analysis of this well-being data. And I hope to have made it so general that all of the papers that will be represented during the workshop can somehow find themselves in this general set of assumptions. But maybe they don't, and then that's useful too. Okay, so first of all, what do we generally want to do? I think in general, it's the case that we want to know how variation in some variables, so I call them here X, are causally associated with some latent mental state. So that mental state, I call it here S for satisfaction, but it might also be happiness, or it might be some other mental state. And we want to know about this because we believe that S matters. So if you're an economist, you might believe that S, so satisfaction or happiness, is maybe a linear transformation of utility, or is at least closely related to utility. And that's why you care about this mental state. So what do we do then? Typically what we do is we ask a survey question, right? So something like, how satisfied are you with your life, all things considered? And then we record these answers. And I dare say, take the letter R for these answers for an individual I at time t. And we take each response option in their rank order. So when a person says the lowest response option, we might call that, record that with a 1. And when that person says answers with the second response option, we record that with a 2. So in general, we record these answers as RIT equals K when a respondent answers with the Kth response option. And then what we do, at least in most cases, we run just an OLS regression of these answers, rank order coded, on our explanatory variables. And then we get a set of coefficients. And then what we do, in the fourth and final step, we interpret these coefficients as the partial effects of our variables X on the underlying mental state S that we're substantively interested in. But clearly this fourth step is a little bit mysterious, right? And I think there are 3 sort of key assumptions underlying the whole thing, and that we should get really clear about. So the first is the existence that there is some reporting rule connecting S, the satisfaction, the latent satisfaction, and the reports. Then that there's equidistance between the reporting options, and third, that there are common thresholds. So what do I mean with the existence of a common reporting rule? What I mean by that is that this mental state and the reports are related by a rule that has this sort of general form, that you answer with the Kth response category when you crossed some threshold, but didn't yet cross another threshold. So here I said, so you must have crossed the K-1 threshold, but you must not have crossed the Kth threshold, where the taus here are other thresholds. And so I think there are at least 3 ways in which this could go wrong, right? And I think some of the papers talk about different ways in which this could go wrong. And so the first one is a fairly trivial one, that respondents just confabulate. They don't actually have any sort of latent mental state in their heads. And when asked the question, how happy are you? They just make something up that they maybe think is what the interviewer wants to hear. So that's one option. Another one that's maybe a little bit more subtle is that some respondent I interprets the question to refer to S, to latent satisfaction. But then some other respondent, column J, thinks the question refers to some other latent mental state and reports with respect to that other mental state. And the third, and that's quite a related option, is that all the respondents think that this question refers to this one latent mental state, maybe S, while the analysts, so us people that have our academic preoccupations, we all think that this question refers actually to this other thing, call it maybe H. And so there might be a mismatch between what we believe the question refers to and what respondents believe the question to refer to. So that's sort of the assumptions surrounding the reporting rule itself. And then equidistance plus a conditional independence assumption. And I think it's better shown with this picture here. And that's really the sort of assumption that this Bond and Lang paper has gotten quite a lot of attention for. And so shown here is, so what this equidistance assumption really says is that the expected level of the underlying satisfaction is when you move from one response category to the other, that this difference is always the same. So the expected level of satisfaction, say for a respondent being in category 2 compared to respondents being in category 4, is the same difference as, say, moving from a 6 to an 8. In addition, when we use an OLS regression, at least, what we also need to assume that within each response category, the expected level of satisfaction is independent of the explanatory variables that we're interested in. So what we can't allow for is that, for example, unemployed people who answer a 5 are here at the bottom within that response category, whereas employed people who answer a 5 are at the top within that response category. Instead, what we must assume is that within each response category, the expectation of satisfaction is the same across all groups, or doesn't vary with the covariates that we're interested in. So what could go wrong? So first, what could go wrong is that there's some variation within each response category. And it's well worthwhile exactly figuring out how large the biases are that come from that. But another thing that might go wrong is that these thresholds aren't in fact equidistant, but instead that they're in some way concave or convex. So here we have like a concave reporting function where, you know, the difference between a 0 and a 2 is much larger than the difference between, say, an 8 and a 10. But it might also go the other way around. So where the difference between a 0 and a 2 is super small, and the difference between an 8 and a 10 is very large. Or anything in between, maybe response categories in the middle have very small widths. I see Claudia having a question, or no? Okay. So that's the equidistance assumption. And now to the third and final assumption, and that is this assumption of common thresholds. Because what we can do really is we can replace this equidistance assumption with an assumption about the error term. So we might have some idea about how this error in our model is distributed, and then we can get rid of the equidistance assumption. But even for those types of models where the standard model would be an ordered probit regression, we still need to assume that these thresholds are common across all people and across all times. So I captured that here with, you know, the threshold for person I at time t for category K is just the same for all I and for all t. And what could go wrong here? So one thing that could go wrong is that this error term just isn't normally distributed and might deviate strongly from it. And then we're back in the Bond and Lang world where anything is possible. And another thing that might happen is that these thresholds shift in some way. And a simple way in which they could shift is to shift parallelly. And another way for them is to shift non-parallelly. So the parallel shift, I think, can be shown like this, where, you know, here's one person at the top and another person at the bottom. And the person at the bottom is just a lot more strict in her response behavior. And what that might imply is, for example, that, you know, the strict person, for a given level of happiness, here indicated with this age, responds with a 3 because, you know, she crossed the second threshold but didn't yet cross the third threshold. But this other person who's much more generous with her scale use, she answers for the same level of underlying happiness, satisfaction, with a 5, because the thresholds are just shifted a little bit to the left. What might also happen, and I think that's been explored less, is that these response shifts are non-parallel, right? So here what happened is that the scale of this person just expanded outward. So for example, the 4th threshold here didn't change a whole lot, but the 6th and the 5th became stricter, whereas the 1st and the 2nd became less strict. So I think these 3 assumptions are what underlies standard subjective well-being research. And I think the key question now is whether these assumptions are met, what happens if they aren't met, whether there are more assumptions that I couldn't really think of, or that don't fit in within this framework. And I think it's well worthwhile to find out about this, and I hope we can make some progress on that.